Vladimir Putin is no longer just on the defensive. He is in the midst of an all-out alarm.
I'm disappointed in President Putin.
On the one hand, US sanctions are hitting the nerve centers of the Russian economy.
Yeah, we're going to put sanctions. I don't know that sanctions bother him.
On the other hand, Ukraine's attacks have already wiped out about 20% of Russian refinery capacity. What's more, the latest threat to Putin's economic lifeline is not a one-off pressure tactic. It is the final link in a strategy that has been quietly woven and gradually tightened over the years. Now, Putin is cornered by US sanctions. For Putin, it is no longer easy to sell oil to his allies, escape Ukraine's attacks, or circumvent US sanctions. Since last year, Russian oil barrels have begun to change hands in Asian markets, with increasingly larger discount labels. In the international banking system, the term secondary sanctions has turned into a red line for credit committees in cautious countries. Transactions with Russia have been moved to the high-risk category, and the US's second round of sanctions hit the Moscow stock exchanges. So, which date, which decision, and which mechanism shattered the Kremlin's financial backbone? To which new breaking point is this chain heading? Everything broke on June 13, 2024, when Washington added the Moscow Stock Exchange and its critical infrastructure components to its sanctions list. On the same day, the Moscow Stock Exchange halted dollar and euro transactions, currency formation shifted to over-the-counter markets, and transparency plummeted dramatically. The screens went dark on the exchange, and the market moved to over-the-counter, OTC, trading. Russian institutions are now setting prices among themselves, but the loss of a common reference point is pushing the pricing of exchange rate risk and corporate balance sheet planning into a more uncertain territory. This move should be read as a direct blow to the financial infrastructure. It is not the exchange rate itself that has changed, but how, where, and by whom it is determined. In the same document, the Treasury issued guidelines drawing thick red lines for foreign banks on which transactions expose you to secondary risk. In short, the exchange rate board has gone dark, and compliance units on the other side are flashing red. The June 2024 update turned another critical key. OFAC expanded its definition of Russia's military-industrial ecosystem. Significant relationships with all blocked individuals and entities under Presidential Executive Order 14,024 now pose a secondary sanctions risk for foreign banks. The practical result of this has been extra controls, delays, and increased costs in open account, letter of credit, correspondent banking, and swap processes in many markets, including China. Some banks have become cautious in certain areas, while others have seen a sharp increase in price risk premiums. In other words, the cost of doing business with Russia suddenly rose not only as a potential penalty, but also as operational friction, which reduced the flow of financial pipelines. This package also imposed restrictions on invisible areas such as IT services, narrowing the bypass channels on the software-hardware side of supply chains. Sanctions began to target not just the asset itself, but also the supporting layers that enable it to function. In January 2025, the pace accelerated once again. The Treasury implemented a broad package targeting the energy sector and the maritime financial bridges that support it. Risk warnings, restrictions, and direct listings were issued for hundreds of ships and service providers, including major producers and intermediaries. The logic was clear. Russian barrels must pass through a series of gates, insurance, financing, routing, flag, and port services to reach global markets. If you lock each of these gates individually, even if a barrel leaks through, costs rise in the freight insurance service triangle, and discounts deepen. The same approach was implemented throughout the year through strict monitoring and updated compliance guidelines based on the G7/EU/UK price cap coalition recommendations. Fine-toothed filters targeting grey areas such as takeover flag management transfers were introduced in tanker sales. As a result of all these actions, even if the shadow fleet finds a way through, it now operates at a higher cost, with greater risk and at a slower pace. By July 2025, Europe had tightened the cap mechanism to a stricter level. The reference price for crude oil was updated to 15% below the market average, with a benchmark of roughly $47.6 per barrel being discussed. In the same week, London added 135 tankers operating in the shadow network to the list in a single move. Regardless of the ship's flag, name change, or ownership structure, the appetite of secondary actors wanes as soon as service, insurance, and port access become risky. The ceiling was theoretically established with the logic of let sales continue even if revenue decreases. In practice, it operates as a machine that increases discounts to suppress budget revenue while driving up transportation and financing costs. Therefore, the phrase "sales are continuing" does not paint the whole picture. The price, costs, and payment terms determine the bottom line. The real turning point in August 2025 was when diplomacy and the energy war converged at the same table. When the US Special Envoy landed in Moscow on August 6th, he brought with him not only diplomatic courtesy, but also a message that would touch the Kremlin's nerve endings. The envoy was Steve Witkoff, a well-known businessman. Accompanying him was Koryo Dmitriev, one of Russia's behind-the-scenes heavyweights and Putin's trusted shadow advisor. Official statements remained dry and distant. Kremlin spokespeople acknowledged that the meeting had taken place, but shared only two headlines from the content. The first was the war in Ukraine, and the second was a vaguely defined possibility of a new US-Russia strategic partnership. Then, Russian foreign policy advisor Yuri Ushakov made a brief but noteworthy statement to the press. "We sent some signals on Ukraine, and in return, we received signals from President Trump that were in line with those signals." This statement was not a concrete result in diplomatic terms, but rather a maneuver to buy time. There was no concrete agreement or a feasible ceasefire schedule. Although the Kremlin described the meeting as constructive, what was discussed behind the scenes went far beyond the official statements. This is because there was another issue on the table that was just as critical as Ukraine. As you might have guessed, this issue was oil. Approximately 40 to 45% of Russia's budget comes from crude oil and petroleum products. These revenues were also fueling the war in Ukraine. Moreover, a large portion of this export was carried out through methods known as the shadow fleet. Trump's message to Moscow was crystal clear at this point. Either agree to a ceasefire, or these tankers will be your next targets. The 2025 Sanctions Act, awaiting approval in Washington, was the framework for this message. The bill, which has the support of both parties, gives the US president the authority to impose tariffs of up to 500% on any country, including China and India, that continues to purchase Russian oil. This is not just about making Russian oil more expensive, but effectively excluding it from the global market. Donald Trump recently made the limits of this pressure clear. If oil prices drop by another $10, Russia will have no other option. Energy analyst Thomas O'Donnell sums up the purpose of these new sanctions in a single sentence. They are designed not to reduce, but to completely cripple. The plan is simple but effective. The US and its allies will flood the market with their own oil and natural gas surpluses. This will facilitate the implementation of secondary sanctions and virtually eliminate Russia's chances of finding new buyers. In such a scenario, Moscow would not only lose revenue, it would also lose the energy industry that fuels the war, its naval fleet, and its influence as a rulemaker in global energy markets. For Washington, this is a double win. The US would both strengthen its energy dominance and strike Putin with his own weapon. If this coordination continues uninterrupted, the map of global oil flows could change in the coming period. Official data already shows a sharp 27% drop in oil and natural gas revenues compared to the same period last year. This translates to a 19% decline in the state's total energy revenues. Under normal circumstances, this figure alone would be enough to set off alarm bells in Moscow. However, there are other blows that are exacerbating the situation. First, Ukraine's drone attacks on Novoyask have disabled one of Russia's last major functioning export ports. This port was not only critical for crude oil shipments, but also for refined product exports. The disruption there has triggered a domino effect in Russia's supply chains to the Far East and South Asia. Just as this shock was unfolding, the European Union took a new step by lowering the price cap on Russian oil. The maximum price allowed per barrel will now be $47.60. According to Brussels calculations, this reduction will result in a loss of approximately $18.75 billion in annual energy revenues for Moscow. This is not merely a theoretical estimate. Current export figures and market trends indicate a high likelihood that the loss will reach these levels. However, the crisis does not end there. Systematic attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure are severely eroding Russia's refining and logistics capacity. In particular, disruptions in diesel production have caused a supply shock in the domestic market. With refineries offline and shipping routes disrupted, diesel prices have risen to such levels that freight trains can no longer cover their operating costs. This financial pressure has also impacted Russia's most critical internal logistics network, its railways. Some workers on certain routes have been granted 2 days of unpaid leave per month due to the government's inability to pay wages. This is weakening both workforce motivation and transportation capacity. On top of all this, the new sanctions package that the Donald Trump administration is preparing to implement will further destabilize this already collapsing system. What is happening internally? The ruble strengthened throughout 2025, reaching its best levels against the dollar in 15 months during the summer, with appreciation reaching 40% since the beginning of the year. However, this is a currency regime supported by capital controls, tight monetary policy, and exporters' foreign exchange sales obligations, rather than natural market flows. Moreover, it is a double-edged sword. While the ruble's appreciation has curbed import costs and provided temporary relief for inflation, it has weakened the conversion of oil and gas revenues into rubles for the budget and eroded exporters' profit margins. This is why the Kremlin's preference for a controlled weak ruble is frequently mentioned in the literature. However, demonstrating exchange rate strength is sometimes seen as a useful signal for managing the financial friction created by sanctions pressure. In short, the exchange rate picture reflected internally makes sense when read alongside the pressure on payment and shipment chains externally. The friction on the payment side accumulates in statistics as trade receivables. As the banking channel slows down and becomes more expensive, exporters extend more credit to their buyers, creating an invisible cost in cash flow. This reliance on trade credit is one of the clearest signs of the divergence in trade and finance channels with Russia since the war, and it is fueled not only by banks' reluctance, but also by increased documentation requirements in insurance and compliance layers. In other words, the goods go, money comes model is no longer a straight line. Money is coming in later, at a higher cost, with deeper discounts and a broader risk carrier. This is putting much more strain on the cash register than the daily exchange rate. Another outlet has emerged around Type C accounts. In the context of frozen Russian assets in the West and frozen foreign assets in Russia, Moscow has been trying swap-like exchange mechanisms and netting methods for some time. The regulation dated August 7, 2025 opened this valve a little more by allowing certain asset transfers from Type C accounts belonging to foreigners to be transferred to local investors as part of swap transactions. Legal experts are debating how practical this will be in practice, as the counterpart value typically amounts to restricted securities. But one thing is clear, these moves signal an effort to breathe life into frozen payment channels through domestic solutions. On the Western side, similar designs, such as securing Ukraine loans with the proceeds of frozen assets, were discussed around the same time. The two camps are testing different keys on the same file. We can observe how the bottleneck in the maritime sector has grown through the maritime warnings issued by the coalition government. The shipping guidelines updated in the fall of 2024 narrowed the grey areas with provisions such as transparency in tanker sales, separation of cost items in the insurance chain, and classification of unusual changes in the berthing towing flagging processes as compliance triggers. Claims like, "I didn't break the price cap, I just inflated the freight rate," have been made harder to justify with line-by-line cost proof and third-party verification in contracts. This means that the shadow fleet has hit a thicker wall both legally and operationally. The question, has all this turned into panic in Moscow, is frequently asked. The official language is based on resilience and adaptation, but the data says price discovery has become opaque, shipping costs have increased, and payment friction has grown. The strengthening of the ruble has brought relief to imports and labeling, but it is weakening budget items denominated in rubles. Exporters' profitability is caught in the middle of the exchange rate discount freight trio. On the financial side, attempts to unlock the situation with national solutions like Type C are proceeding with the logic of "we'll settle the frozen assets abroad through swaps," while the returns on frozen assets abroad are being debated. In the maritime sector, the cost of ship service insurance services is rising as London and Brussels tighten their caps. This raises new questions for Asian buyers in terms of the price advantage plus risk premium equation. The Kremlin is responding to this pressure through three channels: currency and capital controls, domestic financial swap solutions, and a shift in the direction of exports. A show of strength on the currency and exporters' foreign exchange sales obligations are managing inflation expectations in the short term, while simultaneously reversing the currency's impact on budget revenues. To compensate for this, maneuvering room is being sought in the tax expenditure borrowing balance. Type C and similar valves are being tested in financial settlements. However, in practice, these do not fully open the broken chain but only distribute the pressure. Although the export direction has shifted toward Asia, price caps and service restrictions have made discounts the new normal. Therefore, the net ruble left in the Treasury from each barrel sold is thinner compared to the pre-war balance. Rather than asking whether this picture shows traces of panic or traces of a plan, the most reasonable question is, how fast is money leaving the Treasury, and how fast and with what difficulties is it returning? The opacity of the exchange rate shifting from the stock market to OTC markets is disrupting price risk transmission, while rising costs at sea and increasing compliance premiums at banks are slowing down cash conversion speeds. The Kremlin is aware of this and is opening channels to keep the system afloat through currency capital controls and Type C valves. But the scope of these channels is limited. It is easy to say, I am selling. But what really matters today is, under what conditions am I collecting, in how many days, with what risk premiums, and at what exchange rate am I recording it in the budget? The shield may continue to work, but its strength depends on how much the vault is leaking. What do you see? Is exchange rate strength or friction in the vault more dominant? If price caps and tanker lists remain as strict until year-end, will the discount on Russian barrels stabilize, or will alternative routes erode part of the cost? Will the secondary risk guidance from the banking side create a thicker caveat, especially in Asian finance, or will it settle into an acceptable risk premium standard in selected channels? Share your thoughts below. Let's enrich the discussion with data. If you found this narrative useful, subscribe, like, and share to help us set the rhythm for new episodes together. Thank you for watching.